All right, viewers, it's the 51st day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What does it mean for the possible new world order? In conversation with the senior journalist Fareed Zakaria is our consulting editor, Rajdeep Sardesai.
The Russian war in Ukraine has entered its 50th day and counting. It's a war that has taken a huge human and economic and political cost. A war that has redefined the world as we hope to see it in the 21st century. What does this war then in the heart of Europe mean for a new world order? What does it mean for India, the United States, and indeed the global community? Who better to answer that than our special guest today, world's premier foreign policy commentator, CNN anchor, and best-selling author Fareed Zakaria. Appreciate your joining us, Fareed, there from New York. From your vantage viewpoint, 50 days and counting into this war, what does this war mean for the world community? What does it suggest to you, Fareed?
Thanks for having me on, Rajdeep. Always a pleasure. I think this is the most significant international event that I have lived through, certainly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Just as the fall of the Berlin Wall ushered in a new world and a new world order, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is likely to have those kinds of seismic and systemic implications. It's much bigger than 9/11. 9/11 was a band of thugs who were able to get a lot of attention and get people anxious because of these kind of spectacular acts of terrorism that took place around the world. But it didn't involve the kind of clash of great powers, which has traditionally been the kind of thing that alters the trajectory of the international system. So what you have now is the largest nuclear power in the world, with a veto at the Security Council, Russia, essentially trying to tear up the rules of the road of the post-Cold War order. Trying to basically say might is right. If we feel aggrieved, we don't have to worry about international law or norms or rules. And that's the challenge. Will it work? If it does, I think we are in a very different world, a world in which it is much easier for whether it's China or Russia or, frankly, the United States to act with a certain degree of unilateralism, with a sense that its power will allow it to remake the rules, or it gets pushed back, and the Ukraine is able to stand ground, is able to maintain its independence and maintain its westward orientation. But in either event, what you have now is great power politics, the return of the traditional engine of political conflict and instability in the world that had really been absent since 1989.
So are we, in a sense, seeing the Cold War playing out, but in an entirely new dimension, in a sense between an expansionist Russia at the moment, which wants to expand and revive, Putin wants to revive the old Russian empire, autocracies on one side and democracies on the other? Would that be the way the world will be divided, you believe? Or is this simply just one man's obsession, as I said, with expanding or getting back the old Russian empire?
It's a very good question, and in some ways, it is the central question. Is this a kind of one last gasp of what is really the last great colonial empire of the world? If you think about it, Russia is the last multinational empire that has gone through the phase of decolonization that France went through, that Britain went through. And I think the closest analogy to Ukraine is Algeria for France. The French regarded Algeria as a very special colony. They would often talk about how Algeria was part of France. Algerians were actually French citizens. They were allowed to vote. The Russians often talk of Ukraine in that way, that for them, the idea of Russia being great without Ukraine seems impossible. So that's one way to think about it. And then the other is the one you raise, which is, or is this a much larger autocracies versus democracies struggle? I think a lot depends on how long this goes, how protracted it becomes, and crucially, what China does. because China so far has rhetorically supported the Russians, but practically given them very little sustenance, other than abstaining in the Security Council. They have not really provided Russia with the kind of support that would allow us to talk about an axis of autocracies. My own sense is that China is on the fence, is trying to decide which way to go. And it may not decide in the next month or two, it may take longer. But that crucial question, I think, will determine where we go. Because if Beijing decides that this is the new alignment, then you do have a much larger global struggle. It's unlikely to look exactly like the Cold War, because Russia is much weaker than the Soviet Union was. Declining power, it doesn't have nearly the kind of resources that they had. Look at the Russian army and how badly it's dealt. It's handled all this. But it is a nuclear power. It does have a veto in the Security Council. It can cause a lot of trouble. So, as somebody said, history never repeats itself. It just, it looks like that to those who don't know the details. There are ways in which history rhymes. There are resonances from the Cold War, but it's a very different world. And Russia is fundamentally much weaker.
I'll come to China and indeed India in a moment, but just focusing on Russia, do you think now in hindsight, 50 days on, Vladimir Putin underestimated Ukrainian nationalism? He in some way got this war horribly wrong. And to that extent, that in a sense also suggests how the world is changing. Ukraine today has a strong sense of Ukrainian nationalism, which was underestimated by the Russians, who perhaps just saw it as another extension of the old USSR.
Absolutely, 100%. And it's a larger point, I think. I think we are living in a world in which nationalism is very powerful. Asymmetrical reactions or resistance is very powerful. And the way you can see this is, of course, the Americans underestimated, the nationalism they will find in Afghanistan or in Iraq. The resistance to an outside force coming in is very powerful. In the American case, they thought, well, we're bringing democracy and good government, but you're still the outsider, right? The Russians thought we're reuniting, these people who have a common language and a common culture, but you're still an outsider. And that understanding has been particularly difficult in Russia because there really was a sense in which they didn't just want a relationship of equals. There was a sense they often talk about how Ukraine is the little brother to Russia's big brother. And then finally, the other underestimation that Putin has made is the degree to which there is a bottom-up technological revolution that has taken place, which allows everybody in the world to see what's happening and to sympathize with people who they regard as the victims. So while Russia has been able to hermetically seal off its population from the various kinds of media, the world has not, right? So even in a place like India, where the government may take a certain position, you can tell very, very clearly the sympathies of the population of Indians are with the Ukrainian people, as they are almost everywhere in the world. And you can see that reflected even in UN votes and things like that, right? This is a phenomenon that is unusual and new. Virtually every Ukrainian has a cell phone, which means virtually every Ukrainian has a broadcasting device which allows the world to see what is happening. And I don't know that Putin understood the degree to which that information asymmetry was going to present him with a geopolitical problem.
That's fascinating the way you're putting it, but where does this then leave Putin and indeed the Russians? Because there are various views being expressed about what happens next in Russia, some suggesting this could be the end of the road for Vladimir Putin, others suggesting that Russian resilience is far deeper than one would imagine. How do you see it? Do you see this to be Putin's final stand in a way? Has he been exposed, been given a wake-up call?
No. First of all, remember, any war that tends to cause a kind of rallying around the flag, the country, and the leader. George W. Bush's approval ratings after 9/11 were 92, 93%. They were very high during the Iraq War until it really started to go very badly. So this is, as you point out, only 50 days. I suspect that the polling that shows that Putin's approval rating in Russia has actually gone up a lot is probably accurate, though, doing polling in a as repressive a dictatorship as Russia is always a complicated matter. Imagine if you're a Russian and you get a phone call from somebody that says they're a polling agency and they ask you, what do you think of Vladimir Putin? Are you really going to say you don't like him if you don't like him? So with that caveat, I do think that Putin has strong support.
But do you see an end game? Do you see an end game? You say Putin has strong support within Russia. Ukrainian nationalism has sort of expressed itself strongly. What's the end game then? Is there an end game at all that you see in the foreseeable future? Are we seeing a long drawn out war that could go on for months?
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right. You have the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. Both sides are very strong. Both sides are very tough. Both sides, I think, have committed enough here that they can't back down. For Ukraine, this is an existential struggle, right? So the Ukrainians are defending their home. For the Russians, as you point out, this is a very big country, 155 million. They have a very large army, a roughly 10-to-1 advantage. So Putin is powerful, so he's going to stay with this. I think it's significant that he has withdrawn to the east. So what will really happen now is the battle in the east will determine the fate of this war. The Russians are going to, having Plan A failed, Plan A was to take Kyiv, topple the government, really essentially dismember Ukraine, and reincorporate parts of it into Russia. So that plan has failed. Now it's Plan B. Consolidate the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, but expand them so that you really cripple Ukraine. He's trying to take Mariupol, he's trying to take Kharkiv, perhaps even Odessa, which would cripple Ukraine. If the Ukrainians can push back, if they can even push back so that Russia loses some of the territory it has taken, that would be very significant. But this is going to play out over months. Nothing is going to get resolved in the next few months, and it will get resolved largely on the battlefield. All these people meeting Putin is meaningless. What will matter is whether Russian forces start to lose ground on the battlefield in the east.
Given that you're saying that this could be a prolonged fight, where does that leave the world community? And I start with the United States in particular. You wrote in a recent article, the Pax Americana began to wane for many reasons, including the rise of countries such as China and India, the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the financial democratic crises in the West. Do you see this as, with Russia being the new disruptive force, where does it leave American dominance? How does America respond to a prolonged fight in Europe and indeed American-led alliances like NATO?
I think that in a certain sense, it revitalizes the West, which it already has. And you'll be surprised. People are always, I think, underestimating the capacity of democracies and Western countries to have staying power. There's always been this idea that the democracies are decadent, the West is declining, and it won't be able to sustain the pressure. I don't think this is true. Look at the United States sustained the pressure for 45 years during the Cold War. It still has military bases in places like South Korea and Germany and Japan anchoring those alliances. I think the US will be able to stick this out fine. The issue is it is going to remake the global order, particularly the global economy. We are in, I think, for a prolonged phase of deglobalization, of regionalization, a world in which politics trumps economics. For the last 30 years, economics has been trumping politics. When countries felt they had to do things for economic efficiency, they somehow made the politics work. Right now, I think we're in the beginning of a phase where the opposite is going to be true. Countries are not going to just look for the cheapest source the quickest way to do something. It's going to be about national security, resilience, supply chains that are close to you, self-sufficiency. That's the new world we're moving into.
But you don't see that the limitations of this new world have been exposed. Even the US-led sanctions don't seem to have had the kind of debilitating impact on Russia at the moment. You've got parts of Europe that continue to trade with Russia when it comes to oil. India accessing Russia for cheap oil. America still looking at uranium material from Russia. Does it also reveal the limitations of this new world order, the limitations of the United Nations, that countries can, in a sense, have their own national ambitions, their own nationalisms that do not need necessarily to worry about what the rest of the world thinks of them?
No, it's a good point. But the way I put it is, it reveals actually the strength of globalization. That it's, when I say we're going to go through a phase of deglobalization, the whole thing is not going to unravel. There's too much interconnectivity. There's too much interdependence within the world. Europe is dependent on Russia for energy. Other countries have other dependencies. But as I say, the process is just beginning. So yes, Europe cannot wean itself off Russian energy tomorrow. But mark my words, in the next 3 years, you will see a sharp decline in Europe's energy imports from Russia. I think you're going to find that it's much more difficult to do business with Russia on almost any dimension. The Russian economy, you see this already, the numbers are coming in. There is about a 20% decline in per capita GDP in Russia in 50 or 60 days. The ruble is being held up only because the currency has essentially been turned into a non-convertible currency. So Russia is facing very significant challenges. It's paying a huge price. Will that change Putin's mind? No, because Putin is a dictator. He's impervious to that kind of public pressure. But there is a huge price to pay. And I think what you are going to see is over time, this deglobalization I'm talking about is going to continue.
Given the fact that you're saying we're entering this phase where politics will trump economics, a phase of deglobalization, let's turn to countries like India and China. And let me start with India, your original home country. Do you see India being able to maintain a kind of neutral, independent stand, or will every country have to make choices now? India is harking back to its old relationship with Russia, going back to 1971, but at the same time has a new strategic relationship, a deeper, broader-based engagement with the United States, including being part of the Quad. What do countries, therefore, like India do? Will we have to make choices of the kind that we perhaps at times had to make in the Cold War era?
I don't think India faces quite the same pressure, largely because it is a much more powerful country today than it was during the Cold War. India will be able to have it both ways, if you will, or play this game of arbitrage, where it will be able to have reasonable relations with Russia, at the same time maintaining good relations with the West and with the United States. It's large enough, it's valuable enough to both sides that it could play that game. Now, the question is it the best foreign policy for India? I don't think so. I have, as you know, Rajdeep, for a long time argued that the fundamental strategic reality India has to deal with has been the rise of China. This is the single most significant event in international politics in the last 30 or 40 years. It's a much bigger seismic shift than even the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so the question becomes, in asking, if India were to ask itself seriously, what does that mean for India? I think it means a large-scale, comprehensive reorientation of Indian foreign policy so that it is more closely aligned with the democracies that are resisting a certain kind of Chinese expansionism, whether that's the United States, whether that's Japan, whether that's Australia. It's also a much more congenial, comfortable group for India to be part of. So for strategic reasons, for ideological reasons, for people-to-people reasons, Indians are much more comfortable with the world of the West, the world of countries like Australia, than it is with the world of China and Russia. And again, let's not forget the bottom-up part here. So for all those reasons, it strikes me that the kind of Delhi elite are out of touch with the real currents of India's national interest, where I think which are pushing it or which should push it towards a much closer relationship with the West.
But the fact is, Fareed Zakaria, India has a huge dependence on Russian oil. We've had a strong defense relationship with Russia. And as the Indian foreign minister said the other day, Europe perhaps gets more oil in an afternoon than India gets in a month from Russia. So there are questions about double standards of the West. Should India be looking at the war in Ukraine from a moral position, saying the massacres that we've seen on the ground, the killings of innocent citizens are reason enough for us to take a stronger stand against Russia, or weigh that against this traditional relationship that we've had with the Russians in the past?
Look, nobody has been asking India to stop buying Russian oil. So this is a bit of a straw man. The argument is really not, does India find itself in an awkward position? Of course it does. The question I'm asking is, should India be getting 85% of its advanced weaponry from Russia, which is basically now a junior partner of China? If you do believe that China is the great challenge India faces, shouldn't India be diversifying its defense imports? So what I'm asking is, given the rise of China, given the challenge that India faces from this, should it be importing 85% of its advanced weaponry from Russia? Should it be so dependent on Russia, which is essentially a close junior partner of China? Or should it be trying to rethink its strategic realities, reach out more to the West, have a stronger defense relationship with countries like the United States, with France? I believe that that's a much more powerful place for India to be. It would still be able to have good relations with Russia. That doesn't change. But fundamentally, the question India has to ask itself is, does the rise of China change anything? And in my view, the Delhi elite behaves as though you're the seismic event in world history, the rise of China, directly threatening Indian security and its national interests. And they said nothing changes. We have the same foreign policy we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. How can that make any sense strategically? There is a moral dimension to it, and I think that adds to it. But my fundamental argument to India is, act on your real national interest, act on your real long-term grand strategy.
Because one of the concerns, of course, that India has is the growing equation between Russia and China. And the longer this war continues, the feeling is we will have to see which way the Chinese go and where this relationship develops. We also have our concern about the Chinese and the Pakistanis. We've just seen a government change in Pakistan. One of the reasons being given is Imran Khan was seen with Vladimir Putin at the wrong time. He's, of course, blamed it on an American conspiracy. But we are in a turbulent neighborhood. China on one side, Pakistan on the other. You seem to suggest that we should be viewing the situation in Ukraine from that perspective.
Precisely, because that is India's perspective. Those are India's national interests. Look, the Pakistanis have made their choice. It's absolutely clear. Pakistan is essentially becoming a vassal state of China. And that is a bipartisan Pakistani position. The military holds it, civilians hold it. The aid flows are going to be so great that they will dwarf any other argument. So in a situation where Pakistan has become a vassal state of China, in a circumstance where Russia is, in a sense, the junior partner of China, how should India think about its national interest? And I find it there's a remarkable lack of rethinking, of understanding how to position India in this new geopolitical environment. I continue to say there is also a people-to-people dimension here, which is important to think about. When I sometimes hear some of the Delhi elites telling me, how the West is declining and, the East is rising and India is going to, bet on that. I say to them, when you start sending your children to China, to university, that's when I'll believe that you actually believe in this and are putting your money where your mouth is. The truth of the matter is, India is, as a society, a much more comfortable with dealing with open democracies, with the societies of the West, And that also should count for something. India is a democracy. Its foreign policy should not be made entirely ignoring that democratic bottom-up element.
In a way, when the war started, Fareed, there were concerns that Russia's invading Ukraine, aggression in Ukraine could lead to other countries, autocracies like China, also having similar imperialist ambitions, walking into Taiwan or walking into other parts of the world. Do you believe the last 50 days has been a wake-up call to some of those autocracies that if you do so, the world will be raged against you?
I think a lot depends on how this goes, Rajdeep. I think if the Russians just show that through sheer force and brutality and viciousness and staying power, they are able to prevail in some sense of the word, I think that sends one message, right, to the Chinas of the world, which is, this is going to be very tough. You're going to, there's going to be a lot of international opinion against you, but if you just brazen it out and use every weapon you have and win or prevail, you will be able to have your way. Might will make right, or it will prove that, as you say, the costs are just too high. The costs, because there are two sets of costs here. One was Putin underestimated Ukrainian resistance, and the second, he underestimated global resistance. But the jury is still out. It depends on how this resolves itself.
Did he underestimate Joe Biden as well? From a U.S. perspective, once again, I mean, there was a sense that was Joe Biden going to be tough enough to take on what was happening in Ukraine, a sense that he was a weak U.S. president. Has Joe Biden, in your view, taken the right steps on Ukraine in the last 50 days?
I think he has. I think he's done an impressive job of rallying the world. I think the sanctions have been much more comprehensive than anyone imagined. This is the 11th largest economy in the world. And you have been able to put much more punishing sanctions on it than anyone predicted. I think Putin underestimated, in a sense, the entire democratic world. Because, it's a familiar, as I say, it's a familiar charge that dictators make, that the West is weak, it's decadent, it can't get its act together, it's too concerned about, whatever issues like gender fluidity. And this is all, I think, often mistakes the reality that democracies have a great deal of internal flexibility. And so when they decide that they're going to do something, there is a much, much stronger and more powerful and enduring reality. Remember, let me just give you one example. The United States stayed in Afghanistan twice as long as the Soviet Union did. So when people say that America does not have staying power, America has a lot of staying power. The question is, does it, is it able to pursue a strategy that is effective? And the challenge here will not be Western staying power. The challenge is the point you made. If you have this huge loophole for oil and gas revenues, are you really putting enough pressure? Those are the kinds of challenges. But I think in terms of the fortitude of the West, as I say, the United States is still on the banks of the Rhine. It is still in Okinawa. It is still in South Korea. 70 years after these commitments were made. What dictatorship has maintained those kind of commitments for that long?
One of the other challenges, of course, Fareed, is that we are seeing, as you said, deglobalization, but also post-pandemic, the pandemic and now the war, where several economies, including in emerging markets, suffering. We've just seen what's happened in Sri Lanka. Many believe illiberal democracies, autocracies, one-man shows, those are governments which are struggling to deal with the times in which we live. Is that also a lesson, given your famous thesis of the divide between liberal and illiberal democracies? Will illiberal democracies find it much more difficult to deal with this changing world?
Look, I hope so. I have to confess, sometimes these illiberal democracies are able to manipulate public opinion, to shut down opposition in ways that in the short run are quite effective. But I do believe, and maybe this is just an idealist in me, I do believe that in the long run, open societies, free societies are much more flexible, are much more supple. They are able to weather the crisis of the moment is always hard, but in the long run, the ability to adjust to the world, I think, is much stronger. Look, in the 1930s, everyone said that the democracies were finished. The Depression had knocked the stuffing out of the Western economies, but Hitler was on the march, putting Germans back to work. Mussolini was making the trains run on time. It turned out to not be true. The democracies had greater staying power. In the 50s and in places like India, people used to say, the Soviets are growing faster. They're doing better in the space race. They will overwhelm. They'll win the Cold War. Turned out not to be true. I think that at the end of the day, particularly navigating the difficult economic currents you're describing, which you're absolutely right about, I ultimately continue to believe that democracies have flexibility, they're supple, they have bottom-up innovation. Look at India. So much is going on from a bottom-up perspective. Look at the technological revolution taking place in India. Look at the way in which states are experimenting. I think that's, it never looks as pretty as what's going on in a place like China. But in the long run, I think it's pretty effective. It may, you may give up a little bit of growth, but it's pretty effective. And where would you rather live? Would you rather live in a dictatorship where you have no voice, or a democracy where you have voice?
I just have a minute, and I want to ask you, interestingly, war throws up heroes, and we have in Zelensky someone who's become, in a sense, the symbol of the fight against the Russians, and a symbol of Ukrainian nationalism, but a global figure. So I guess that, in a sense, is also a lesson to the world that you never know. Where heroes are thrown up tomorrow, and where, individuals emerge who are capable of taking on mighty autocracies.
Absolutely. And it reminds you, Rajdeep, that at the end of the day, what we admire and what ends up being important are the things that we've always admired in human beings. Courage, bravery, fortitude, intelligence, the ability to communicate. I mean, these are in some ways some of the oldest virtues that people would write about in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And even today, in 2022, that's what we admire in human beings. That's what we admire in leaders.
Fareed Zakaria, you've given us a global perspective of the Ukraine war and what it means, the lessons from it 50 days later. As always, your thoughts are most valuable, and I appreciate that you've taken out the time to give us your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us here on India Today. Fareed Zakaria, pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Rajdeep.